Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that helps you cut through all that noise out there and really get to the insights you need to be, well, truly well informed. Look, the world is just overflowing with information, right? Trying to make sense of complex social stuff, political phenomena, it can feel like trying to drink from a fire hose. And that's exactly why we're here. We want to offer you a shortcut, basically. We take a whole stack of sources, distill the crucial knowledge, and hopefully uncover those aha moments that, genuinely change how you see things. Today, we are diving into some truly fascinating and frankly pretty vital. We're going to systematically compare the Make America Great Again movement, MAGA, against established academic characteristics of cults. Now, let's be absolutely clear about our mission here from the get-go. Our goal isn't about sticking a label on anyone or anything, especially not a negative one. No, instead, we're here to rigorously examine the shared psychological mechanisms, the sociological ones too, and also the really critical distinctions between the two.
It's all about helping you foster a more nuanced understanding of, modern political loyalty. We're absolutely committed to impartially reporting on what our sources say. We'll lay out the facts as they're presented in the material we've reviewed and just let the insights kind of emerge from that evidence.
Exactly. And to do that, we've really dug into a very detailed report. This isn't just scratching the surface. It draws heavily on well-established sociological definitions, psychological ones too, of what constitutes a cult. And it combines that with extensive, pretty rigorous analysis of the MAGA movement itself. So the objective here is purely an evidence-based exploration. We want to give you a solid framework to think about a topic that, let's face it, often generates way more heat than light.
All right. So with that mission clear, let's peel back the layers. Let's start with the movement itself. Where did it come from? What does it stand for? And crucially, how has it changed over time? Okay, so first, grounding ourselves in the MAGA movement, its origins, its core ideas, as our sources describe them. I mean, the start of it all is just completely tied to Donald Trump's 2016 campaign slogan, right? Make America Great Again. What's really insightful, though, is how quickly that phrase, that simple slogan, turned into this huge, enduring force in American politics. It went way beyond just the campaign. Now, interestingly, a version of that phrase Ronald Reagan actually used something similar back in his 1980 campaign.
That's right, but the sources make a point of saying Trump reportedly came up with his specific version, Make America Great Again, back in November 2012. And then he trademarked it.
Yeah, he trademarked it, which, kind of suggests a very deliberate, maybe long-term vision, even before his presidential run really got going.
It wasn't just a throwaway line.
No, definitely not. So at its foundation, the movement believes the U.S. has seen this big decline, right, from some idealized past greatness. And what's really key here, according to the movement's narrative, is that this decline isn't really blamed on, say, internal policy choices or economic cycles primarily.
No, it's overwhelmingly pinned on what they see as foreign influences.
Right, both internal ones like immigration and multiculturalism, and external ones, mainly globalization.
And the fix, the way back to greatness, involves these America First policies.
Which means things like strong economic protectionism, really drastic cuts to immigration, especially from developing countries.
And promoting, or maybe even enforcing, what supporters call traditional American values.
And our sources don't really pull punches here. They give specific examples, like Trump's call back in 2015 for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Yeah, which predictably got huge criticism for being discriminatory.
Exactly. And that example really highlights how explicit the movement can be about targeting certain perceived foreign influences. But it's not just about policy positions, is it? The movement itself is characterized by this combative disposition.
Very much so. It's almost emblematic of the extreme partisanship that's become so common.
And there's just been this explosion of rhetoric that critics often point to as being homophobic, sexist, racist, or even inciting violence.
And at its core, the movement fits what our sources call a classic populist framework.
Right. And for anyone maybe less familiar, that framework basically splits society into two groups that just can't be reconciled.
You've got the pure populace on one side, the true patriots, the forgotten people.
And on the other side, the corrupt elites or other perceived enemies. It's that constant us versus them.
Exactly. And that strategy, that's not unique to the U.S. at all. The sources point out parallels globally.
Yeah, they mentioned Marine Le Pen in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Matteo Salvini in Italy.
It shows there's a kind of common playbook for mobilizing people by setting up these really stark oppositions.
So this overarching ideology, often just called Trumpism, it's quite a mixture.
It really is. You've got right-wing populism, anti-globalism, national conservatism, neo-nationalism.
And as the sources detail, it often includes elements described as illiberal, authoritarian, sometimes even autocratic beliefs.
Some scholars have even gone so far as to call it an existential threat to American democracy.
Wow, and the rhetoric itself relies heavily on, well, anti-immigrant attacks, xenophobic themes, nativist stuff, often aimed at minorities.
And alongside that, you get this potent mix of conspiracy theories, isolationism, Christian nationalism, evangelical beliefs, protectionism.
Anti-feminist ideas, anti-LGBT beliefs, that's
Yeah.
a very specific and, powerful ideological cocktail.
What's really clever, or perhaps effective, is how the slogan MAGA itself functions. Our sources call it an open signifier.
An open signifier, meaning
Meaning it sounds simple, but it's intentionally broad. It lets all sorts of different groups project their own meanings, their own frustrations, their own hopes onto it.
so it acts like a big tent initially anyway. It pulls together very different kinds of people under one banner, even if they interpret it differently.
Precisely. Gave it incredibly wide appeal at the start.
But now what's really fascinating is how the movement seems to have evolved. It's moved beyond just being a campaign thing.
That's right. Recent analyses suggest it's shifted from being sort of reactive to something much more structured, more proactive.
Like how a potential second Trump presidency is described, not just a change of government, but potentially regime change.
Exactly. And a direct attack on the values-based worldview and its expression in democracy. That points to a much deeper ideological goal.
Our sources even call this phase a thoroughly prepared revenge toward any kind of values-based worldview, and they point to Project 2025 as an example.
Right. Project 2025, for anyone who hasn't heard of it, is this huge, detailed plan put together by conservative groups. It's basically a blueprint for completely reshaping the federal government if there's another Republican administration.
And it aims to do things like increase presidential power, reduce the influence of career government employees, push a more nationalist, socially conservative agenda.
And it explicitly draws on the work of post-liberal thinkers. These are intellectuals who are critical of classical liberalism, the focus on individual rights and secularism. They often want a return to tradition or a national identity or religious authority as the basis for society.
So this whole evolution, it signals a really fundamental shift, doesn't it? From just reacting to grievances to having this structured, proactive ideology.
Definitely. The early populist appeal tapped into existing discontent, sure, but things like Project 2025 and calling the movement a cult of force suggests a deliberate long-term strategy.
A strategy to reshape not just government, but maybe society's values too.
That seems to be the implication. It suggests a deeper level of commitment, maybe even ideological indoctrination among followers. It's moving way beyond just supporting a politician. It's about aligning with a whole worldview.
And that ties back to the open signifier idea you mentioned earlier.
It does. What's compelling is how that initially broad appeal seems to have narrowed.
So while MAGA once let lots of different groups feel included,
This ideological hardening, as the sources call it, suggests the acceptable beliefs within the movement have become much more rigid, less open to interpretation.
so it's less about diverse interests and more about a shared, specific ideology now.
Exactly. The sources frame it as far more ideologically driven than interest-oriented. They even call it an outright attack on the principles of liberal, social, Christian, conservative, or ecological democracy.
Wow. So making America great again is now seen primarily as a cultural project and a cult of force.
Echoing elements of social Darwinism, the sources say. It really underlines that this isn't just about policies. It's about fundamentally changing cultural norms and power dynamics. And that demands a deeper level of buy-in, that ideological commitment from followers.
Which brings us squarely to the leader. This is where it gets really interesting, looking at the central figure, Donald Trump. He is without doubt the central figure. And what's kind of paradoxical, as our sources point out, is his wealth.
Right. You'd think that might clash with a populist message, but supporters often saw it differently.
Yeah, they saw it as proof he understood the elite he was supposedly fighting. Like, he couldn't be bought because he was already rich.
And his style.
Very distinctive.
Oh, yeah. The bullying, the personal insults, the name-calling, the constant boasting. Yet somehow that fostered this perception among his supporters that he was an ordinary person, a regular guy.
Someone completely different from polished, conventional politicians. It's a powerful paradox.
And our sources point out his base has been explicitly compared to a cult of personality. And that comparison isn't used lightly. It comes from the incredibly deep, often unquestioning loyalty he inspires.
Trumpism itself is noted for having authoritarian leanings and this belief that the president is somehow above the rule of law.
And his supporters often see him not just as a politician, but as something more, like a morally flawed figure handpicked by God.
Handpicked by God to do what exactly?
To lead these profound missions, maybe achieving justice or fighting some existential evil. It elevates him beyond politics, almost to messianic status, even if they acknowledge flaws.
You see that reflected in his rallies too, right? The sources mention prominent Christian nationalism.
Absolutely. And his 2024 campaign has even been described as a righteous crusade against enemies like atheists, globalists, and the Marxists.
His whole rhetoric uses these absolute terms, these dire threats. It constantly rejects the entire political establishment as corrupt.
He really does embody those traits of an authoritarian leader. Huge confidence, a compelling presence, powerful rhetoric.
And this knack for presenting himself as one of them, speaking their language, validating their feelings.
And crucially, that Manichaean demonization of enemies.
Manichaean, that's the worldview that sees everything as just pure good versus absolute evil.
Exactly. No shades of gray. Opponents are portrayed as inherently evil.
And his followers, often calling themselves the forgotten men and women, they show this willingness to just subordinate themselves to him, even when he breaks rules or defies legal orders.
Our sources suggest his use of personal branding was key here. He leveraged his celebrity status really effectively to market himself as this extraordinary leader.
So he's both the relatable outsider and this almost divinely chosen figure at the same time.
It's a very potent combination.
So who exactly is drawn into this movement and what's really driving them? Well, MAGA has huge support within the Republican Party. One estimate from late 2022 suggested 4 in 10 Republicans identified as MAGA Republicans.
And initially, it really resonated by tapping into these deep-seated grievances people had.
Fueled by, as the sources say, strong negative emotions of anger and resentment.
Mm-hmm. And these feelings often stem from perceptions of threat from newcomers or seeing others getting ahead undeservingly, this sense of being left behind or treated unfairly.
Creates fertile ground for that message.
Absolutely. And this is where we hit a really significant psychological factor, those authoritarian underpinnings.
Authoritarian underpinnings. Tell us more about that.
Well, public opinion data consistently shows that something called right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA, is a very strong predictor of support for Trump and MAGA.
RWA. What does that involve?
It's basically a cluster of traits. A strong tendency to submit to authorities seen as legitimate, aggression towards groups perceived as outsiders or threats, and a really rigid adherence to conventional norms.
Okay. And there's another factor, too.
Yes, social dominance orientation, or SDO. That's about preferring group-based hierarchies, believing some groups should naturally dominate others. SDO is also strongly linked to MAGA support.
Ah, okay. So this, for you listening, this is a key aha moment, right? How does a leader like Trump connect with these traits?
Well, think about it. A leader who defies rules but demands absolute loyalty, who aggressively demonizes opponents. That kind of leadership style perfectly resonates with and activates these pre-existing authoritarian personalities.
So it creates a kind of feedback loop.
Exactly. A powerful self-reinforcing loop. His style attracts people with these tendencies. Their psychology makes them highly receptive to his message, and his behavior then reinforces their authoritarian views, making them even more loyal and less likely to question things.
That really connects the leader's style to the follower's psychology.
It establishes a crucial link, suggesting why these dynamics can feel so strong, almost cult-like in their intensity.
Looking deeper at the followers, support is also linked to someone's positionality in the context of white patriarchy.
Right. The data shows white men have the highest support, followed closely by white women.
And this authoritarian dynamic among these voters, it's not just about keeping things the same. No, sometimes it manifests as this willingness to tear the whole thing down to achieve their goals.
Wow. And followers show strict adherence to the conventional norms of the good in group.
Submission to and adoration of authorities, and antipathy to the point of hatred and aggression for those who exist outside of them.
So identity seems even more important than, say, economic class.
That's what the sources indicate. Factors like racism, high SDO, Christian nationalism, feeling a loss of social status, these all align strongly with MAGA.
And demographically?
Generally more likely to be male, older, white, strong conservatives, actually relatively well-off economically, and Christian.
And they often believe their changing circumstances are due to some kind of organized conspiracy.
Yes, that conspiracy belief is common. And a significant chunk also endorse core ideas from the QAnon delusion complex.
QAnon, that baseless theory about a secret cabal and Trump fighting them.
That's the one. And think about the 2020 election. That November 2020 poll found 70% of Republicans believe Trump's false claims about voter fraud.
70%. That's staggering.
It is. The movement's been described as a mass delusion fueled by charisma, shared grievance, aspiration, and a stubborn rejection of inherited truths.
And for the supporters themselves, hearing their own, maybe previously unspoken, rageful, incoherent sputtering voiced by the most powerful person in the world
Is described as heady, fortifying, and vindicating. It validates their deepest feelings.
So putting it all together, understanding who gets drawn in and why, it's this complex mix. Grievances, psychology, the leader's specific appeal.
Deeply rooted in identity, both personal and collective.
Okay, so now that we've really explored the MAGA movement itself, to apply this analytical lens properly, we need that framework. What exactly is a cult from an academic standpoint? Can you lay out those key characteristics from our sources?
Absolutely. This is fundamental for the comparison. Academically, cults aren't just any group. They have specific core traits. They're defined as social groups characterized by their extreme religious, philosophical, or spiritual beliefs focused on a particular personality, object, or goal.
Extreme beliefs focused on a person or goal.
Right. And they often use devious psychological techniques to gain and control adherents. Think high-pressure recruitment.
Okay, and they stand out somehow.
They're usually marked by socially deviant practices or novel beliefs that set them apart from the mainstream. The APA dictionary adds they're often religious or quasi-religious, have unusual or atypical beliefs, practice seclusion from the outside world, and have an authoritarian structure.
Authoritarian structure, seclusion. That sounds intense.
It is. They tend to be highly cohesive, well-organized, secretive, and hostile to non-members. A key feature is intense devotion to a particular person, idea, or object.
Devotion, control.
Exactly. They exert a high degree of social and psychological control, often isolating members, using manipulative techniques for loyalty. They're often called high control groups because they influence thoughts, feelings, behaviors through strict rules, information control, social pressure, manipulation.
It controls how you think and feel, not just what you do.
Precisely. And just to reiterate, we're using cult here analytically, based on these definitions, not as an insult. It's about observable characteristics.
Got it. So what about the leaders in these groups?
Very clear patterns. The leader, or sometimes the core group, is seen as always right, unquestionable.
And they're the only source of truth.
Pretty much, the leader or group is considered the exclusive means of knowing truth or receiving validation. No outside information is really credible. The leader usually has this idealistic sense of a radical mission, a grand purpose, plus personal authority and extraordinary qualities that set them apart. Seen as special, maybe even divinely inspired.
Okay. And how do they get people in and keep them there?
Specific strategies. Recruitment often happens in seemingly normal places: social media, discussion groups, community events.
Not necessarily in secret.
No, often quite publicly at first. But they strategically target vulnerable prey, people looking to escape unhappiness, seeking belonging, acceptance, meaning, maybe people with insecurity, mental health issues, disconnection. A key early tactic is love bombing, showering recruits with love and validation. It's incredibly powerful if you feel isolated. Makes you think you finally found your place.
Ah, the love bombing.
Then, as indoctrination proceeds, many cults systematically separate members from their old lives, family, friends, jobs. They gradually remake their identities to fit the group.
And sometimes it goes further.
In some cases, yes. Compelling people to surrender money, possessions, even their bodies, using punishment, deprivation, threats to foster dependency, and a fear of leaving.
And what about people who do leave?
They're frequently demonized, seen as always wrong in leaving, negative, or even evil. It's a strong warning to those still inside. And within the group, there's often this pervasive feeling of never being good enough, always striving for approval.
Wow. And how do they view the outside world?
They often cultivate an unreasonable fear of it.
Yeah.
Beliefs in impending disaster, evil conspiracies, persecution. They tend to be hostile towards non-members, seeing them as dangerous or misguided.
And that leads to the seclusion you mentioned.
Yes. Historically, that often meant physical seclusion, living in communes, remote compounds. But this is where we get a really crucial modern aha moment for you, our listener.
Okay.
The concept of seclusion has evolved. While physical isolation was traditional, the principle is limiting outside influence and controlling information.
And now?
Now, in the digital age, you can create powerful echo chambers, separate realities. Through targeted media, social media algorithms, discrediting mainstream sources, a group spread out geographically can achieve a level of informational and ideological control that's remarkably similar to a physically isolated cult.
So seclusion can be digital now, not just physical.
Exactly. It's a fundamental shift. It makes these characteristics potentially much more relevant to large, dispersed groups operating openly but maintaining tight ideological boundaries.
That's a huge point. And finally, what about money?
Often a lack of meaningful financial disclosure, no independently audited statements. They might make members surrender money or assets without real accountability. Financial opacity is often a red flag.
Okay, so we have these clear academic characteristics. Now, for the main event, let's see how the MAGA movement stacks up against this framework, point by point. Right. This is the core of our deep dive, a systematic comparison based on the evidence in our sources. We'll take each characteristic we just outlined and see how MAGA aligns or where it differs. First up, leadership and charisma. Cult trait, led by a charismatic figure, worshipped, seen as infallible, exclusive source of truth, extraordinary. MAGA trait. Donald Trump is undeniably the central figure, his base likened to a cult of personality. He cultivates that ordinary guy image. But supporters also see him as extraordinary, even handpicked by God, uses Manichaean demonization. Followers subordinate themselves even when he breaks rules.
It's a populist adaptation of that charismatic leadership, creating intense, almost unquestioning loyalty.
So on this point, the sources suggest a high similarity.
Agreed.
Okay. Next, ideology, belief systems, and truth. Cult trait. Extreme, unusual beliefs, fear of the outside, conspiracies. Leader group as the sole source of truth. MAGA trait. Believes U.S. declined due to foreign influence. America first. Promotes conspiracies like birtherism, replacement theory, the stolen election, characterized by conspiracist, Christian nationalist, anti-immigrant themes. Significant QAnon support. That 70% belief in false voter fraud claims. A stubborn rejection of inherited truths, belief in organized conspiracy, creating separate realities reinforces the leader group as the arbiter of truth.
Again, the parallels in how truth is defined and controlled within the group seem very strong.
So another high similarity here, according to the sources.
Yeah.
Moving on. Group cohesion, loyalty, and social control. Cult trait. Highly cohesive, intense devotion. High social psychological control. Hostile to outsiders, demonized leavers. Members feel never good enough.
Right.
MAGA trait. Marked by extreme partisanship, strong us versus them. Exhibit antipathy, to the point of hatred and aggression for those who exist outside. Loyalty is intensely focused on Trump, often more than the GOP itself. Frequent scapegoating of minorities, opponents seen as corrupt elites, supporters feel vindicated.
Now, the never good enough part might be less explicit, but the constant pressure for loyalty, for ideological purity, could create similar psychological dynamics, right?
Yeah.
Constant need to prove you belong.
Good point. So overall, the cohesion and control aspects also point towards high similarity.
I'd agree with that assessment based on the sources.
Okay, let's look at recruitment and adherence. Cult trait.
Yeah.
Target the vulnerable, use love bombing, remake identity, foster dependency. MAGA trait. Tapped into deep-seated grievances, anger, appeal to the forgotten, offers vindication, empowerment, strong link to pre-existing authoritarian traits. RWA STO.
So it's not the intimate one-on-one love bombing of a small cult, maybe, but appealing to those deep grievances and offering validation fulfills a similar psychological need on a mass scale, drawing people in.
Right. It attracts those looking for belonging, meaning, answers, leveraging those psychological vulnerabilities. So the tactics differ, but the function is somewhat similar.
That seems fair, which is why the sources might suggest a moderate similarity here. Similar function, different scale, and specific methods.
Makes sense. Okay, information environment and external perceptions. Cult trait. Seclusion from the outside world. Active information control.
Yeah, the control aspect is key.
MAGA trait. Actively suppresses criticism, limits alternative views, fake news, leads to fragmentation of the U.S. infosphere, creates separate realities via digital platforms, spreads disinformation, election fraud, capital insurrection blame.
So it's achieving that seclusion effect digitally and ideologically, not necessarily physically, discrediting mainstream media, creating echo chambers.
Exactly. It functions like information control, ensuring the narrative isn't challenged from within. The sources even compare it to the Kremlin's authoritarian playbook. Think of Trump telling people to stop crooked Hillary rigging this election or the 2020 claims.
That's a powerful parallel in terms of controlling the information landscape.
So this looks like a high similarity conceptual, acknowledging the digital adaptation.
Yes, conceptually, the control mechanism is very similar.
Finally, financial aspects. Cult trait. Lack financial disclosure. May compel members to surrender assets without accountability.
Often very opaque.
MAGA trait. Operates extensive TAC network. MAGA Inc. Save America. Within legal campaign finance rules, subject to disclosure. Masters small dollar donations. Financial incentives noted for spreading disinformation, covering debts, funding activities. The Trump accounts idea was a policy proposal, not a demand for personal assets.
So structurally, it's different. It's operating within the legal system with disclosure, unlike many cults.
Right, but functionally, mobilizing vast resources for the leader and the movement.
Functionally, there's a parallel in resource mobilization, even if the structure is legal and regulated. So the sources classify this as low structural similarity, but moderate functional similarity.
Okay, that clarifies the financial picture.
So just to quickly recap that comparison for you, we see really strong parallels, high similarities in the charismatic leadership, the ideology built on specific beliefs, and the leader as the source of truth, and that intense group cohesion with the US versus them dynamic.
And the information control, conceptually.
Yes. The way a separate reality is fostered through information control shows high conceptual similarity, adapting traditional methods for the digital age.
But divergences start to appear.
Right. Mainly in the financial structures, legal versus opaque, even if the function is similar. And in recruitment methods, mass appeal versus intimate love bombing. This comparison really helps pinpoint those specific dynamics that might make someone use the term cult-like analytically.
Okay, so those similarities are striking. They really reveal some deep patterns. But as you said, it's crucial to acknowledge the fundamental differences too. What does this all mean? It's not just about similarities, but where are those lines drawn and why do they matter so much?
Exactly. The distinctions are just as important for a clear understanding.
So first off, nature and objective. MAGA is fundamentally a political movement, right? Operating inside the U.S. democratic system, integrated into the Republican Party.
Its main goal is political power, implementing policies.
Whereas traditional cults are usually religious or quasi-religious, focused on spiritual aims, communal living, often outside the mainstream.
Right. Their goals are typically spiritual or lifestyle-driven, not primarily about taking over the government. That basic objective makes a huge difference.
Then their scale and scope. MAGA is massive. Millions of people spread out, integrated into society.
Very different from typical cults, which are usually much smaller, more insular, often on the fringes, sometimes physically isolated. That scale changes everything.
And that links back to the form of seclusion. This is a really key difference we need to stress.
Absolutely critical. Traditional cults often use physical isolation compounds, withdrawing from contact.
But MAGA's seclusion is mainly ideological and informational, creating those separate realities digitally without necessarily demanding people leave their families or jobs.
And this really shows how those control mechanisms have evolved for the digital age. You can achieve similar informational and ideological control over huge numbers of people without physical walls.
It suggests a blurring of the lines between politics and high-control group dynamics, driven by information control, not physical separation.
It's a significant insight into modern movements.
Okay. Then financial structure. MAGA's finances, while huge and centralized, operate within legal campaign finance laws. There's disclosure, public scrutiny, at least in theory.
Which contrasts sharply with the often opaque, unregulated, sometimes exploitative finances of many cults, where personal assets might be demanded without accountability.
And finally, barriers to exit. Leaving MAGA might mean social fallout, losing friends or family connections because the loyalty demands are so high.
But it doesn't usually involve the physical threats, the actual deprivation, the forced surrender of assets, or the kind of legal traps you might see in high-control cults. The social pressure is real, but the physical and financial barriers are generally different.
Okay, so those distinctions are clear. Now let's talk about the actual debate around the cult label itself. We've used it analytically, carefully, but in public conversation.
It's often used pejoratively. Carries connotations of irrationality, fanaticism, even mental illness.
That can just dismiss people's actual grievances or political reasons for supporting the movement, right? It kind of shuts down understanding.
Exactly. Our sources note that while journalists use cult as a term of art to describe the stronghold Trumpism seems to have,
they also caution it can be an alibi for liberals, just wanting the movement to collapse rather than trying to understand why it's appealing.
Yes. It risks oversimplifying things, reducing it to a psychological problem instead of engaging with the complex societal factors at play.
So labeling the whole movement a cult, that can be a political act in itself.
It absolutely can be. It risks alienating supporters even more, dismissing their concerns, and basically hindering any chance of constructive dialogue or de-escalation.
So it's vital to distinguish between identifying specific cultic characteristics, which is what we've done analytically,
And just slapping the label cult on the whole movement, which can be politically loaded and unhelpful.
academics are usually more careful, using terms like cult-like aspects or cult of personality.
Generally, yes. They acknowledge the shared dynamics, but often avoid the full cult label for large political movements to respect the term's traditional links to religion and physical isolation. It allows for nuance without inflaming things.
That distinction really is paramount, isn't it, for maintaining objectivity and actually understanding this complex phenomenon.
So to wrap up our deep dive for you, the MAGA movement, while fundamentally political, demonstrably shows several characteristics that strongly align with academic definitions of cults.
We saw those overlaps. The charismatic leader demanding unquestioning loyalty, seen as the source of truth.
The strong us versus them ideology, intense group cohesion, hostility to outsiders.
The embrace of conspiracies, rejection of outside facts, creating that separate reality.
The strategic information control, and those deep psychological underpinnings of authoritarianism that make followers receptive.
But, and it's a big but, we also have to remember the crucial distinctions for the full picture.
Absolutely. Its vast scale, its integration into mainstream politics, its political objectives.
It's informational rather than physical, seclusion, its operation within legal financial frameworks.
And the different barriers to exit. These clearly separate it from the traditional understanding of a cult.
So this whole analysis really highlights how group dynamics are evolving, especially with digital technology.
It really does. It shows how ideological isolation and control can happen on a mass scale now, blurring those old lines between regular politics and high-control groups.
And for you, listening, understanding the psychological vulnerabilities, the social grievances that make people susceptible to movements like this, that's just key for being an informed citizen today.
This report, this analysis, it's a tool. It helps illuminate patterns, structures, behaviors. It's not about applying a definitive label. By comparing these characteristics systematically, you gain a much more nuanced grasp of the complex forces at play.
It contributes to a broader understanding of modern politics and why people adhere so strongly to certain movements. So here's something to mull over until our next deep dive. As our information world keeps changing, becoming more fragmented, how can we, as informed citizens, get better at telling the difference between genuine grassroots movements and those that might be using cult-like dynamics to create these separate realities? And what responsibility do we have in navigating this incredibly complex landscape? Think about that.